Welcome everybody to Photographing the World, Cityscape, Astrophotography, and Advanced Post-Processing. In this tutorial, we're going to take you guys to 5 very unique and beautiful countries, all with something different to offer. We're going to kick things off in Cinque Terre in Italy. It's a beautiful little village on the coast of Liguria. Awesome photography opportunities there. Then we're going to kick it up a notch in Rome and shoot some of the most beautiful ancient architecture in the world. From there, we're going to change things up a bit. We're going to be heading to Singapore, Hong Kong, and Cambodia to experiment with different types of architecture, both old and ultra-modern, before we head back to New Zealand to photograph the night sky. If you've already watched Photographing the World Landscape Photography and Post-Processing, I was able to kick things off by introducing you to many of the post-processing techniques that I use on a daily basis, but we only kept things to natural light landscapes. Over the years, I've become well known for a specific post-processing technique that I call blending moments in time. And essentially what that means is I'm able, by using a stationary camera, to blend different pieces of time together. In the landscape photography tutorial, we never really had to deal with much artificial light, but this time we're going to have to blend both artificial light and natural light together in a harmonious way to get the most beautiful image possible. Since we're covering so many advanced post-processing methods in the different styles of cityscape photography, I also wanted to include my favorite genre of photography, astrophotography. So we're going to take some specific examples, we're going to learn how to do star trails, and we're going to learn how to capture the Milky Way. This entire tutorial is structured to get more difficult as we go. So I'm going to start off with some reviews of some basic concepts in Photoshop, but I'm going to start ramping up that complexity very quickly. So you may not want to jump around because each lesson is going to build off the previous instruction. We've had a great time creating this tutorial over months of production. But enough talk, let's kick things off in one of the most beautiful places in the world, Manarola in Le Cinque Terre in Italy. Welcome to the incredible Cinque Terre. Cinque Terre literally means 5 lands in Italian, and it stretches along a rugged portion of the Ligurian coastline. It's also part of the Italian Riviera. Over the centuries, people have been able to build terraces in the rocky coastline. Cinque Terre has become very famous for travelers and photographers because there are very little signs of commercial development. It's very difficult to reach these towns via car, and it's linked only with trains, ferries, and pedestrian walkways. That means when you come here, it feels like going back in time and stepping into a piece of history. Each of the 5 villages offers an amazing diversity in subject matter and compositions. The 5 villages that make up the beautiful Cinque Terre are Rio Maggiore, Manarola, Cornelia, Vernazza, and Monte Rosso al Mare. We rented a nice little apartment in the town of Vernazza, and we're going to be here for 6 days teaching different photography techniques. From a photography standpoint, we have so much diversity to capture in these 5 little villages. Beautiful Italian homes line the rocky coastline, the waves crash on the rocks, and the sunset seems to be in the perfect position every day. Now, this is a region of Italy that's very close to my heart. Years ago, when I first got started as a travel photographer, I made this one of my first locations that I really concentrated on creating images for my portfolio. Over the years, I've made many return trips here, both as a photographer and just as a tourist, somebody who wanted to spend time in one of the most beautiful places in the world. Over the years, we also started developing photography tours in Italy, and this is one of the biggest highlights, these 5 villages. Since I have so much experience with this location, both photographically and also running photo tours, I thought it would be the perfect place to show you techniques that I use in my photography. In the last video, we focused 100% on natural landscapes, and while I love natural landscape photography, this is where I get really excited as a photographer. This is the perfect place to start because it's a seamless blend of old architecture and beautiful landscapes. Later we're going to move on to Rome, which is just an old urban landscape followed by ultra-modern cities. So this is a great place to start because it blends landscape photography with old architecture. So right now we're in beautiful Rio Maggiore. Let's move on to Manarola, where I've planned out the perfect blue hour shot. So today I'm really excited to be in Manarola, which is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful of the 5 towns in Lake Cinque Terre. So in our last tutorial where we covered landscape photography, we really didn't get into artificial light because we were waiting for the perfect light to happen from the sun. We waited for that last beautiful sky that the sunset produced. With this type of photography, especially with this type of ancient architecture, we're really waiting for the artificial light to happen too. We want to find a nice balance of the natural light that we've already worked with and the artificial light from the lights in the city and the towns. So right now you can see how the sun is hitting the city in a beautiful way. In a little while, as the sun starts to come down, it's going to start to throw some yellow followed by pink light onto the city. After all the light goes down and we start to get into twilight, we're going to enter a period of time known as blue hour. During the blue hour, we'll be able to see all the windows and all the lights on the buildings come alive. And during the blue hour, there's also still enough ambient light in the sky where we can start to balance the natural light that's in the sky, those soft reflections of that light on the city, and all of the artificial light from the lights in the city below. The great thing about the artificial light in the city is they're sort of a constant. The street lights are always going to come on. There's always going to be a certain amount of windows that are lit up. All we need to do to be able to see that is wait for it to get dark enough. That's why blue hour is so beautiful. Blue hour happens before it turns completely black in the sky. And when the sky still has a little bit of blue in it, it means there's still some light that exists too. So our foreground elements with that blue light are nice and soft and still have a little bit of exposure value to them. So for this type of photography, I really like to focus on the most beautiful times of day. And that range of time is golden hour through sunset and through blue hour, which is also called twilight. Now, after the sun sets, there's going to be a progression of different blue hour phases, from civil twilight to nautical twilight to astronomical twilight. If you go on to any of the weather services like weatherunderground.com and you search the sunset time, it'll be followed by these 3 twilight zones. So basically, that means an early blue hour, a mid blue hour, and then astronomical twilight is pretty much full dark. So if there's a sunset, let's say this time of year around 4:45. Civil twilight might start around 5:15, and then 20 minutes later we might be at the peak of the blue hour, which is going to be nautical twilight, and then at the end of the blue hour will be astronomical twilight. Now, the time for the blue hour is not necessarily just an hour. Depending on the time of the year, if it's summertime and we have very, very long days, that blue hour transition may last an hour or 2 hours, depending on where our position is on the globe. Obviously, higher north, when the days are much, much longer, we'll have a longer blue hour. Closer to the equator, we're going to have a really short blue hour. It might be a short 15 minutes. So the goal of working with blue hour is to set up way before sunset happens, have everything ready to go, so when the light starts to get perfect, we're ready to capture it. So the reason we're shooting this in the PM blue hour is for a few reasons. One, it's really easy to get up for the end of the day instead of getting up early for the shot. But there's one particular reason. And the reason is, if we want to take advantage of the lights on in the town, more people have their window lights on and the lights on in their apartments at nighttime. In the morning, if you shoot a city or ancient architecture or anywhere else in the world, most of the street lights are going to be off, most of the people are going to be asleep, and not many lights in the town are going to be on. Another great reason to shoot during the PM blue hour is it gives you hours of time you can arrive beforehand to perfectly scout your location, figure out the shot you want, and really make sure that it's everything that you want in your frame before the blue hour starts. As you can also see with the beautiful light on Manarola behind me, that this whole region is really special during sunset. It's not to say that you can't get beautiful shots during sunrise, but during sunrise, the sun position is actually quite different. So sunrise for Manarola, it rises behind Manarola, so you never really get light on the subject itself. With landscape and architectural photography in general, backlighting can be problematic because it tends to wash out and darken the foreground. So if you have tremendous light behind an object, your objects will end up being really shadowed and really dark. Right now, we're standing in the main tourist viewpoint of this beautiful town here to my left. And as you can also see, there's a lot of people around. We're here in the off-season in the wintertime, so there's a lot less people here. But at any given moment, just because it's such a popular place, not just for photographers, you're going to have to deal with people being sort of all around you. So it's something to take into consideration. And it's also a reason why you always want to arrive extra early, just in case there's a lot of people already set up if you come too close to the sunset or the time you're shooting. So it's always good practice to arrive a little bit early, make sure you can stake out your spot if that's the spot that you want to have. When we come to locations that are as popular like this and as beautiful, the first reaction is usually just to go to the main viewing area and get the shot, because we have to admit it's extraordinary as is. But as photographers, we really want to try to craft something different for our imagery. So instead of staying in this vantage point, the normal tourist viewpoint, we're going to look for something a little bit different. And in this case, we're going to climb down some of these rocks so we can use those rocks as a foreground element that frames the water and the town behind it. But before we go down there, I just want to talk about shooting from viewing areas like this. So there's a couple things you need to know about this. Right now, there aren't very many people set up around me, but once there are, there's going to be people leaning on this rail and there's going to be kids hitting it like this. And that's going to cause vibration. So the first thing that I want to do when I set up my tripod is I want to make sure that the feet of the tripod do not touch any part of this metal railing. If they do, the vibration from the metal railing will transfer to my tripod, and once we get to the blue hour and night shots, we're going to need longer exposures, and it's going to cause our frames to be blurry. The second most important thing about setting up your tripod in these busy areas, especially narrow walkways, is you don't want to extend the legs all the way. So once these people go by, I'll show you guys, if these legs are extended all the way, it's way out here. One, it doesn't give people enough space to walk by, and even worse, it means they're going to kick this and trip over it. So if you're setting up for a shot and you're in the middle of a long exposure at the perfect time of night, somebody kicks it, your shot's ruined. Worse, they could kick it, they could hurt themselves, knock over your tripod, and damage the gear. So you want to be very courteous. Pull the legs in a little bit, so shorten the legs a little bit on your tripod, and actually don't keep it out all the way. So keep it away from the rails, put it down, and keep it so it's nice and shallow. We want to make sure that as we're standing here, we can use with our body can block this leg so people have to walk by us and they won't accidentally catch their foot on this. So try to keep it as compact as possible to allow people to walk by and not accidentally hurt themselves or potentially trip over the tripod. So here, along the main walk here, there's actually some stairs at two different locations. They're actually blocked off and chained, and it says dangerous descent, because storms can come in and it can be very dangerous. So it's not a difficult climb down, but it is a little bit technical. There are some very sharp rocks, and with the heavy gear, it can be a little bit tricky. So you want to be really sure of your footing. Now, I'm not encouraging dangerous behavior here. It's, as I said, it's not very difficult. But if you don't feel confident descending some rough terrain to get the shot, then by all means, don't do it. I don't want to put anybody in harm's way or make them feel like they need to do something dangerous to get a better shot. The shot up top is very beautiful as well. For this instruction, though, I want to talk about foreground elements and framing rocks and have them frame the background and the water. So we're going to do something that's, I wouldn't call it risky, but I wouldn't advise it to anyone unless they feel that they are physically fit and capable to be able to do it. So as you can see from down here, we sort of have a foreground element playground. So it's really nice. There's a lot of really safe areas we can stand, set up our tripod, and use some of these rocks as compositional elements. And also getting down to about this area hasn't been that tricky at all. There's nobody else down here with me. So I think it'll be safe to just go down a little bit further. And again, this is just going to be up to you to experiment with compositions. I'm going to move around until I find something both compositionally pleasing and also easy to set up. So before I start shooting, let's talk a little bit about the composition. I've put my camera into live view video mode, and now I'm recording in 16:9. So compositionally, we're working with a wide frame. Again, keep in mind that 4:3, we're going to have more on the top and the bottom, but this will be a good example to talk about the foreground elements that I'm trying to capture in the shot. So down here, since we're closer to these rocks, now at a wider angle, we can actually frame some of the rocks below the town and still have plenty of sky to work with. So right here in the video mode, the first thing you'll see is I have the horizon centered. I'm shooting with a 16-35 lens because I'm very, very confident that I want something at least wide to medium wide for this shot. So the first thing you'll notice is I only have one rock sort of jutting out in the bottom right third of this image. Now this is 16:9, so we're going to have to exaggerate just a little bit more to get those rocks in the foreground. If I didn't have these black bars on the top and the bottom, then we'd see a little bit, but we're still going to want more. Now generally with this type of photography, you don't usually want to have your horizon perfectly centered. And in this case, since the foreground rocks are going to be such a main element, it makes sense to have at least 60% of the foreground and 40% of the sky. So let's go ahead and take it down a notch and see what that looks like. If I start moving down to about 60%, you can see I start to get these nice rocks in the foreground. So that's looking pretty good. I'm going to leave it right about there. And I'm also going to make sure that my horizon is nice and level. Now we're looking at a shot that becomes much more interesting. We've created a foreground interest and used the rocks as a framing element to frame some of that water and some of the Manarola and sky behind it. So it looks really, really nice. If you went the other way and you went up, let's say, for example, it still looks pretty good, but it creates a completely different feeling. It's basically created Manarola as an island, and now you have a lot of sky to work with. Now, this sky is pretty nice, but there's not a lot of interest on the top. It's mostly blue. Most of the sky is down towards the center of the frame, which is actually to our advantage this time, because when we move this down, we still can have all of that detail in the sky and get the best of both worlds with some of the rocks, a lot of the sky detail, and the town completely. So now that the composition is completely set up and I really love my shot, what's next is we're going to wait for the light to change. So for this shot in particular, while we're going to shoot through sunset and all the way into blue hour, we're only going to use one frame from the perfect blue hour. Later in this tutorial, we're going to shoot all the way from sunset through blue hour, and we may use multiple frames from different moments in time to combine one scene. So as far as focusing goes, I focused on my background. My background I used a high area of contrast between two of those buildings to make sure that everything was fully sharp. Now these rocks are so far away from my camera is shooting at a wide angle, so they'll be perfectly in focus too. I'm shooting at a very low ISO 64 at f8 so that I know everything, all my edges are going to be sharp throughout. I'm also shooting using 3 exposure brackets. And the reason being is I want to make sure that I capture those strong highlights on the clouds. Now, a good rule with exposure bracketing is to capture everything that you think you may need. Now, it turns out I might not need to use all 3 in the final shot, but it's nice to have them just in case I need the proper exposure. Another thing that I'm using for this shot is the Nikon intervalometer. Now, I'm not using intervalometer settings right now. I'm actually using it just as a trigger. So this connects to my camera, and with the 3 brackets enabled, if I press and hold this button, it'll fire off all 3 in sequence. The nice thing is I don't have to touch the camera to do this. If I touch the camera, as it starts to get darker, I'm going to be doing long exposures, and any vibration from my hand will cause softness in my frame because it'll move it, and it'll cause a blur as it's exposing. So what this does is it eliminates me having to make contact with the camera at all. So we haven't been out here very long, and you can also see that the sun is starting to disappear behind the cloud line. It's very close to the horizon, and now everything's starting to get really, really soft. A few minutes ago, there was some golden light. It was much more interesting than it is now. So what we're going to have to do is wait out the blue hour. So as soon as it starts to turn into a twilight, get a little bit darker, the lights are going to come on in the city, and it's going to come alive again. So the light changes a lot between late afternoon, gold hour, and sunset. We're approaching a sunset now, so I'm not sure with this scene today, with the type of clouds that we have, that we're going to get too much color in the sky. And right now, for me, the conditions look a little bit flat, even though it does still look beautiful since it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. I liked it about 15 minutes ago when there was still some nice soft light on the buildings. Now, obviously, it's hard to get a bad shot in these locations. Even in the middle of the afternoon, it's still very, very beautiful. But I'm really looking for that perfect shot, the shot that I want to show people and have them want to visit this location for themselves. For me, I've always felt a really special connection to the blue hour shots when I can still see the details in the sky and the town lights up for the night. For me, that just seems like the perfect moment in time that captivates me and makes me want to visit these places. So my goal is to capture it that way and hopefully influence people to visit for themselves. So the sun is just about to set, and we're already starting to see some of the brighter city lights turn on. It's still not visually impressive as far as the lighting that's happening from those lights because it's still a little bit too light outside to be able to see those artificial lights and how they illuminate the area around them. So we're going to wait a little bit longer and capture the shot again. So we're about 15 minutes past sunset, maybe 20 minutes. And as you can see behind me and in this frame, we're already starting to get some lights on in the city. So the big main lights haven't come on, but we're very close to Christmas. And what I'm noticing is something I haven't seen here before, which is really interesting. We have some Christmas lights. So that's sort of an extra bonus, some lights that I didn't expect to happen. So in the next 20 minutes or so, once we start to enter in the blue hour, when the light starts to fade in the sky a little bit more, we're going to start to see those lights becoming a little bit more powerful and affecting the areas around them, and we're going to see more of the city lights turn on. So basically now it's just a waiting game. Blue hour has just begun. So remember a little bit earlier I was saying that I was shooting 3 exposure brackets to cover the clouds. Now I also like using 3 exposure brackets to cover the highlights in the lights. I don't like my lights to be too blown out, so I want to use an underexposure sometimes so that I retain that detail in the highlights. Now I had it set to 3 exposure brackets, that's 1 under, medium, and 1 over. But when I reviewed my frames, I noticed that I still probably wanted 1 more under, so a -2. So rather than changing to 5 exposure brackets this time, I left it at 3, and I used the EV shift function to go down 1 stop. And what that did with the bracketing enabled is it took those 3 brackets and it shifted them all to the left. So now what I have is a -2, a -1, and a 0. So now that everything's starting to look really good, I'm going to continue to shoot all the way until it becomes full dark. Because when I'm looking through this little LCD, sometimes things look perfect the way they are. But when I get things back into Lightroom and I'm looking on a big monitor, sometimes 5 minutes later or 5 minutes earlier was actually the best time to select. It's hard to say until you can really look at those files big. So it's nice to shoot through the entire lighting event and then choose the best one later. So as you can see in this shot, we have a really nice amount of artificial light in the town. The city, the buildings are starting to illuminate and have this nice little glowing aspect. Similarly, the lights from the town are also reflecting in the water, which is creating a really nice effect. And we still have enough ambient light in the sky, so we see this nice, beautiful blue behind the city, and there's still enough light to illuminate the shadows on the city as well. So now we're entering into the full blue hour. This is by far my favorite time to shoot scenery like this. Now, once we're in the blue hour, the light's going to start to deteriorate very, very rapidly. So that sky's going to get too dark for photography. So what we really want to do is use that 10-minute window of perfect blue hour time and capture as many frames in that time as possible. So later on in post, on a bigger monitor, we can take a look at all those frames and see which one worked the best. Sometimes looking through the viewfinder or in the LCD on the camera isn't quite enough because you're looking at a really small representation of the scene. So it's becoming so dark outside that we're going to have to use a video light, so I'm going to become more brightly illuminated here, as you can see. Now, a good rule when you're shooting exposures that are longer than a few seconds, sometimes this kind of backlight can enter the camera and cause light leaks. And on Nikon cameras, they sort of have a notorious light leak right around the viewfinder. So the best thing to do if you have any light, now obviously we created this light, it doesn't usually exist, but if there was a street light back here, I'd want to close the viewfinder to eliminate any kind of light spill that would happen and potentially damage my frame. Now, my settings have stayed the same throughout this shoot. I've actually had the white balance at auto because it's really good on this camera. I've had it set to a low ISO of 64 and f8. Now, as it starts to get darker, it's always good to take a look at what that frame is. Now, I'm shooting 3 exposure brackets, and my base exposure, the first one, the -2, is going to be 8 seconds at f8. That means the next one's going to be 16, and the final one is going to be 30. So that's going to be perfect because 30 seconds is the max exposure I can get without switching it to bulb mode. So if you look over my shoulder right here, we are at the peak of blue hour. It's the perfect blend of natural and artificial light. So even though I feel like Blue Hour is perfect right now and nothing could get better, I'm going to go ahead and stay a little longer and shoot all the way through to full night. So right now, as you can see, everything looks perfect. The sky's beautiful, the foreground's beautiful, the lights are all turning on, the colors are popping, everything looks great. From here, the light's going to start to deteriorate, meaning that it's going to get so dark that we're not going to be able to retain and pull any of that detail from the foreground because there's not enough light on the sky to cast any light on the object. We'd have to rely instead 100% on the artificial light, which will still look interesting, but it's not going to have that full tonality of the scene. It's really getting to visit places like this in the world that make me so happy to be a travel photographer. These are the types of things that I live for, getting to enjoy these extraordinary scenes and experience these places that people dream to visit. All right, so it's full dark outside, so that's a wrap. As you can see by the last frame I just took, it's getting too dark to be comfortable. There's no balance between artificial and natural light anymore. It's just really, really dark in the shadows and very contrasty in the highlights. I really like what it looked like about 15 minutes before this. So now it's time to take these raw files into Capture One and start making it the perfect shot. Everyone, welcome to the post-processing studio. We're going to be talking about the Blue Hour shot that we got in Manarola. If you watched the first part, the in-camera portion for this lesson, you remember that we set up in different positions. We got really low. We used the rocky foreground, which ended up being very beautiful and a great call. But we also focused on the right time of day. So we watched the progression all the way through sunset, through the golden hour, and then all the way into Blue Hour, past twilight, and into full dark. So what I've done is I've picked the best moment in time, my favorite portion of Blue Hour, and that's what we're going to look at today. So let's get started. Since this is the first lesson we're going to take a look at, you're going to have to open up the companion files if you want to follow along. And if you expand that folder in the Capture One folder, you'll see Lesson 1, Italy, Manarola. And if you open that folder, you're going to get Capture One to open pretty much like this. But something that can happen, if you move these files around to different hard drives, different computers, sometimes the linking can get lost. And you'll see a little question mark come up here, or it might say footage missing. In order to fix that, you can go over to the folder tab here, and basically under folders, my drive's called working drive, yours might be called something else. So you have to locate the raw files folder, and all you do is right click and then say locate, and repoint that to the raw file folder associated with the lesson, the missing files. It's pretty easy and pretty straightforward, and hopefully it won't happen, but if it does, that's how you take care of it. Something else I'd like to point out about the post-processing studio, as you can see, there's lights everywhere. In fact, even for the lights that you see, for the few lights you see, there are like 5 lights you don't see that are illuminating me from every different angle. When I'm doing my final post-processing, I do it in pretty much a dark room with very little ambient light so I can mitigate any reflections on the screen. So when you're doing your final post-processing, you probably won't be doing it in a television-style studio. You won't have this problem. But it's just something to point out. So I don't usually post-process in a beautifully lit environment. So just something to keep in mind as we go through this. Here we go. Now, inside of Capture One here, this is how Capture One defaults. This is basically how it looks on load. But if you're coming from a Lightroom background and you're using Adobe Lightroom a lot, I use both. Sometimes I like to make it look a little bit more like the same application. So you can actually go up to the View menu, to the drop-down, and put Place Tools on the right side. All that does is it flops the workspace so all the tools are on the right. Just like Adobe Lightroom now, you have all the tabs and the tools on the right. So that'll be consistent. And really that's the biggest difference between the interface is just the tools swap. So this is a good way to fix it. Not a big deal at all. If we take a look at these files, I've included 2 files. Now these files are from the same series of brackets, but I brought 2 files in because I wanted to take a look at the difference. So you see down here, this one says ISO 64, 30 seconds at f8. Now take a look at the way the water is, nice and soft, looks pretty good. The underexposed, the -1, you can see is definitely underexposed, but it also is only a 15-second exposure. So the difference between a 15-second exposure and a 30-second exposure makes a huge difference in the softness of the water. So right off the bat, looking at these two exposures, I would rather use this one for the water. But it does have some hot spots here. Now, I've added one more tool on here, and this little looks like a road sign that show exposure warnings. If I click on this, you're going to see the areas that are blown out. That shouldn't be a big deal. We can also go over to the histogram here, and you can see that we do have some clipping on the right side. If I go down to the underexposed one, you can see that I still have some areas that are starting to be a little bit blown out. This happens, and I talk about this often throughout this tutorial, both in the field and in post-processing. When you're shooting natural and artificial light, the lights from the buildings at nighttime, at twilight, become the most bright and vivid thing. So that's why we're shooting exposure brackets so that we can then blend them together. In this case, I want to keep it simple because it's the first time we're back in the studio together on this tutorial, so I want to make sure that we do it with one file. And this time, we're going to use the one that I like the water the best. That's the one that I want to work as a base. Throughout this tutorial, I'm really going to be focusing on Capture One software for my raw processing instead of Adobe Lightroom. Now, I like Adobe Lightroom and I also like Capture One, but I feel that Capture One is better with color with the files that I use all the way through Canon, Nikon, and especially the Fuji X-T1. It's way better out of the box at color rendition than Adobe Lightroom. Secondly, it's way better at softening and sharpening while we're in the raw state. The interface is a little confusing if you're not used to it coming from an Adobe Lightroom background, but I'm going to go ahead and get into how to use it. And again, don't panic. It's really not that complicated with the software. We're only going to really be using a couple of tools to balance raw files while we're in Capture One. You can go to the Capture One website, you can download the free trial, you get 30 days, no watermarking, unrestricted. And if you really like it, it might change your workflow entirely, and at that point you can decide whether or not it fits to have it as a purchase. This is just raw processing, so if you're not interested in using Capture One, you can follow along by using Adobe Lightroom, just Adobe Bridge and Adobe Camera Raw, or Iridiant Developer, or any other raw processing software. Don't feel like you need to use Capture One. It's just the one that I wanted to make sure you guys know how to use because I feel the tool set is really complete. Before we get into the processing here, let me just re-familiarize you guys with Capture One, since this is either your first time using it, or you haven't watched the other tutorial for a while, or you're just curious and you like to relearn things like I do all the time. Basically, all of the tabs here that we're going to be focusing on, I already showed you the file one here, and that's where all your files go, so we can actually select all images. This is how I link the file. And then we have the camera settings here, which are basic camera settings. And then the next one that actually becomes important is this tab right here. It's called Lens Correction. This is where we're going to do our distortion, sharpness, and light fall off, chromatic aberration, things like that. The next tab is actually going to be where we're going to do most of our work, and that's the color editing. And the next one after that, that's where you're going to do exposure, HDR effects there, curve, clarity, and everything like that. So the brunt of the workflow is going to be done between color and the basic adjustments here. Past that, we have some details where we can change the sharpening, noise reduction, different things like that, cropping, and selective adjustment. So it's pretty much going to be concentrated right around those tabs. As far as the tools go, basic idea is the same thing. You have the arrow tool, you have the hand tool. It follows the same hotkeys as Adobe products and Adobe Photoshop, to where if I hit spacebar, I can actually pan around my image. Command plus is going to zoom in, Command minus is going to zoom out. So that's really nice. So it's seamless throughout. Basically, you have a bunch of buttons that you won't ever use here, like undo and redo, which you can do with Command Z and different things like that. So anytime I introduce a new tool or anything inside of Capture One, I'll make sure to introduce it first. But for my basic purposes here, I'm going to be doing just the raw adjustment, and then once we get the raws exactly right, exactly how we want them, we're going to bring everything into Photoshop for further adjustment. Let's talk more about this file in particular. Now, I picked this one because it's the peak of the blue hour. I actually shot tons of different files. I just wanted to give you guys the ones that we're going to work on because if not, this would be a 50 to 60 gig download file, and that would be unacceptable. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the highlights here. We know that those are clipped, and let's just talk a little bit about what's going on here. First of all, it's a blue hour. The white balance in the camera picked it up almost flawlessly. You can see we have the beautiful blue in the sky, great water, and I have the nice warm tones from Manarola itself all the way around stretching on the rocks. If I go to the underexposed one, there's a little bit of a highlight on the rocks. I'm not sure. We had a lot of lighting on me when I was doing this scene, so some of that light could have pooled here. In this case, it kind of worked to our advantage, to be honest. So what we're going to do is go ahead and balance this. Later on, I'm going to get into blending multiple exposures to mitigate problems in the highlights, but this time we're going to do it all in one for a review. So in this case, I'm going to leave the Kelvin and the tint the same. I think it did a great job with the color, and I'm going to go right to this tab here, and we're going to talk about balancing the histogram. Right off the bat, we know that the highlights are a little bit blown out, and we know the shadows, we can see they're a little dark. So what I'm going to do is pull the exposure down to try to save these highlights. I'm going to do that just a little bit. Maybe negative 0.3. And then if you remember, if you haven't used Capture One before, basically all of the recovery that we do, if we were in Adobe Lightroom, we'd be changing shadows, highlights, whites, and blacks. And that's going to do all of our recovery or clipping of the lights and the shadows. Inside of Capture One, they've built it all into a really intuitive, easy slider of highlights and shadows. So if you want to recover the shadows, we just can drag shadows, and you can see that it'll pull the shadows out. As it starts to pull the shadows out, we see that the histogram moves, and we leave some of that clipping behind. So that's really great. We can just go ahead and compensate for the shadows. The nice thing is, too, if I pull exposure back more, I can overcompensate with the shadows because just like in Lightroom or any raw editor, this is a nonlinear workflow, meaning that I can move anything along this graph inside of the raw application and it doesn't destroy it. It just shifts it around. Once I export, it bakes all those adjustments into more of a flattened image that doesn't contain as much information as a raw. So right now I have a lot of freedom to pull the exposure down a little bit, pull the shadows up, and then also if I start to pull the highlights over, you can see those highlights will start to clean up. And you can even see if I turn this on, if I start to pull this over, you can see that those highlights will start to disappear. And it's really only affecting those areas, only affecting the sky, so it's doing a really nice job. So I can get rid of some of those hot spots really quickly. And what I'm really trying to do is just get rid of this one spike here. That's the only thing I'm trying to get rid of. While I do that, I also have to keep in mind that these lights, if I zoom in, I'm going to pan over a little bit, these lights will always be blown out. That's just going to be the way it is. They're hot, hot lights. Even if you expose -5 brackets, if you do 16 exposure brackets, you're still going to end up with that hot spot there. So you have to pick a sense of acceptable hotspot, and you want this area to be white because it is the brightest. What I'm really concerned about are these yellows. These yellows, that's what I'm trying to protect. And by changing the highlights, you can see that I'm protecting those yellow tones, but still leaving the clarity of the full highlights here. So that works really well. So that's a basic adjustment. I'm going to leave clarity and structure alone. In this option here in the lens correction, I've already seen that distortion is set to 100%. I'm shooting this with the 16 to 35 Nikon. It's important that I remove the distortion here. It's also important that I remove the light fall off. Light fall off is the same thing as vignetting, so I want to make sure that those are both 100%. Capture One has something unique. Not many raw processors have the ability to do what's called sharpness fall off. You guys have heard that, or maybe that you've heard that the center of your lens is always sharper. Well, that means since the center of your lens is sharp, the edges sometimes become less sharp. So if you're shooting at severely wide angles, 14 millimeter, 16 millimeter, even 18, sometimes the edges can be softer. So if I zoom in on the edges here, I can take a look. Everything looks really sharp throughout, but check out the edges here. Notice how it's starting to get a little soft. If I change the sharpness fall off, you can actually see, it's hard to see, but what it's going to do, with the same pattern it finds the vignetting, or the light fall off, it's actually going to overcompensate by over-sharpening the edges, bringing it back to something that's a little bit normal. This is going to be up to you, but for wide-angle shots, I like to leave everything here at 100%. We can also either hide distorted areas or not. I always elect to have this unchecked just in case it crops something that I don't want it to crop. So with everything here, I'll reset the view for us. We have everything set just the way that we want it. Any final tweaks? Remember, on top of these tweaks here, we have the HDR, and then we can always clamp the highlights, clamp the shadows, or even change the midtones just by dragging this. So it's a very powerful editing software and a very powerful editing package overall. So with everything like this, I'm going to leave all of the sharpening and the noise reduction in place, and we're going to go ahead and load this into Photoshop. Before I do that, I'll just go ahead and compensate just a little bit more for that rich darkness. So what I'm going to do is right-click this. I'm going to say Export a Variant. This is a good time to point out what I like to do is export everything that I do, whether it's Lightroom, whether it's Capture One, whether it's Adobe Camera Raw. That's a little bit different, but for the most part, I like to get everything out of the editing software, the raw editing software, and into Photoshop. The cleanest way to do that is to export it. And in Capture One, it's export it as a variant. So as a variant means that it's going to change it. It's going to export it as a PSD. I have this routed to a temp folder on my desktop. I'm going to pick 16-bit throughout this tutorial. Sometimes it'll be 8-bit, but 16 allows us to push the colors even further without banding. And since we're going to be doing a lot of advanced stuff, I want to maintain the best clarity possible. I'm going to tell it to be Pro Photo. That's my working color space. You guys may be working with Adobe RGB or sRGB. I recommend either Adobe RGB or Pro Photo because it's a higher color gamut throughout. I have it set to 300 DPI, 100% scale, and then as a post-action, I have it set to open in Photoshop. So all I have to do is click Export One Variant, and this file will open in Photoshop. I have another PSD open right here, and this is the before image. This is without any corrections inside of Capture One. And what I want to do is start building these in a way that we can watch progressively as we start to make changes to these files. So what I'm going to do is actually bring this before image into this after image, and I'm going to do that with a hotkey combination of Select All, Command A, Copy, Command C, and then Command W just means close this. I won't save it. It's going to bring me to that other PSD, and I'm going to paste it using Command V right on top. It's just we don't want it to be on top, so I'm going to double-click on the background layer to turn it into a real layer, and now we're going to have the original raw and our adjusted raw. As you can see, the original one's already very beautiful. The adjusted one starts to bring all of the levels down to sort of a par. Now this is reminiscent a little bit of the old HDR days when we put all our files into HDR software, if you ever did that, and then it would put it all into one result, and you notice that it would look a little bit more like a mid-tone image. The reason is we have a lot more mid-tones in this image. There's not as stretched out of a histogram from black to white because we've actually brought the shadows up and we brought the highlights down. And what that does is it creates a mid-tone centric image. But that's okay because it's a good base to start working with, and then from there we can start to make further adjustments, and then we can decide where the whites are blown out and the blacks are clipped. It's up to us. But what we've done first is we've corrected it down to a balance, or what I call a par. First thing that I want to do in this file is adjust any issues, or basically find any issues in the scene that I want to get rid of. And if I zoom in a little bit on the water, these are basically buoys. These buoys are, you see the soft buoy here is a result of a 30-second exposure. All these little things here I might want to get rid of. The other thing we have to sort of verify is whether or not there are any spots on the lens or spots on the sensor. Here we actually have a little bit of a star. There's just some little things up, and here we go. Here's some dirt on the sensor. I'll actually blame the previous location I was shooting in, not in Italy. It really depends where you're shooting and how often you change lenses in the field. But that just doesn't seem like it's that many things. But let's go ahead and get rid of that all first. So I'm going to do everything on a clean layer. First thing I'm going to do is make a new layer, and I'm going to select the spot healing tool. I have it set to content aware, sample all layers. And what I'm going to do is just say, fingers crossed that brushing this in will allow me to get rid of it. And basically I just have a medium brush here. I'm just going to click and let go. And you know what? Thankfully, it actually fixed it. That looks pretty good too. So any of these little things I'm going to see if I can get away with the quick way, which is just going to be the content aware. And sometimes with content aware you have to click a couple times. Sometimes it does a great job. Sometimes it completely fails. But basically for little spots on the sky, little things like that, it's really easy to get rid of. This little star, this is actually Venus probably, we can just get rid of that very easily. It's even smart enough to put the same amount of noise back in place. We're going to have to do this throughout. Sometimes it's impossible to find all these things right away, but it's still a good practice to get rid of as many as you can from the start, because they don't really look good if you have them in your final files. So just any kind of cleanup. This is also later on, we'll be cleaning up people, we'll be cleaning up objects, we'll be doing some complex object removal, simple object removal. But for this one, the great thing about shooting over water is that you really don't have to worry too much about that. Like even this, I know that's probably a boat or a buoy, and it looks great, but I'm going to use the clone stamp just to get rid of it a little bit. And with the clone stamp enabled here, I have it set to aligned and also current and below. That means it's going to paint on this layer here and sample everything that's below. That's very powerful. I'm going to set my flow to 10%. I'm going to hold Option here, and I'm basically just going to click. So if you want to do this more of a manual way, I prefer the clone stamp. I find it a little bit more artistic. It's also nice if you have edges. Content aware is bad with edges, but with a clone stamp I can actually select the edge of the water here. You can see that I can pick the edge of the water, paint right over top, and I'm able to get rid of those distant boats on the horizon. Now if you like distant boats on the horizon, feel free to leave them in as well. Now that that is finished, what I'm going to do is check my horizon line. I'm going to do that by doing Command R for the hotkeys to bring up the rulers, and I'm just going to look here and see that actually my horizon line is slightly off. So I always use my in-camera level, but I always have to check sometimes when you don't have a discernible horizon line. In this one, you have to zoom in really far to figure out where the water meets the sky. This is going to lead me into the next step that I like to do, and that's manual distortion removal. You may be thinking now, we already removed the distortion, the lens distortion in Capture One. What do I mean by lens distortion? Well, here's what I mean. Notice how our lines here, if I draw some more guides out here, notice how the lines of this aqueduct and this road right here, notice how they start to get banded and bent up and back as we get further to the scene. Now pay special attention to parts of the scene like this. Now, these lines should be linear, they should be parallel. With all of our cityscape photography, these need to be parallel. In the previous tutorial, we were working on landscape. So if a mountain is a little bit bent or a little bit warped, chances are you're not going to be able to tell. Grass doesn't always grow perfectly linear. But in this case, anything on the buildings that's wrong is going to register as perspective problems. So we have to correct that. I'm going to set up some guides just so that I can manually change this. And I really want to work on first the horizon and then these lines, and they're going to become very important. So I'm going to set some guides here. And now let's talk about exactly why this is happening. Why is this happening with this scene? Well, take a look at this distribution. Remember in the field, I think I mentioned this during the video portion where I wanted to frame up the rocks. By framing up the rocks, I had to push the camera down. When I push the camera down at a wide angle, if you do this with any camera, even if you pick up your camera right now in your living room or in front of your computer and you tilt it down, you're going to notice how everything's going to distort. So if I tilt it down, everything's going to distort this way. If I tilt it up, it's going to distort. Basically, this is the way it's going to happen based on a horizon line. If you have a perfectly centered horizon, you wouldn't have this problem, but since this is basically a 60-40 split, that's what that is causing these problems. Sometimes people will accept the fact, they'll understand this. They'll look at it and say, well, his camera's tilted down and it's a wide angle. But in the fine art world, if you're going to upload this to 500px or anywhere it's in your portfolio, this will register to me 100% as a mistake. So it's better to take care of it in the beginning so you don't have to worry about it later. Since we're not bringing in any additional layers for blending, you can go ahead and do this now. And in order to do that, we're going to do it manually. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom out one level here. I'm going to select all my layers. And with all of those layers selected, I'm going to pick Command T. So when I press Command T, that's going to bring up Transform. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and pan. What I want to do first is I want to fix the horizon line. So we're going to go ahead and rotate this just a hair down, just a little bit until my horizon feels, let's see if it feels level. It was actually up. There we go. So until that looks about right. Now we have to eyeball this. We want to make sure that it's perfect. Later on, we're going to look at some techniques to do this inside of Capture One for cityscapes. But here, I want you guys to see how you can do it if you aren't using Capture One, because Lightroom has a built-in one-button toggle, and either it works or it doesn't. Chances are you won't like it, so you'll have to do something manually. Now that that's been done, let's go ahead and warp this. And we're going to warp it with the standard controls of your transform layer. We can go ahead and change the scale, the bounding box. Chances are you guys have used this. If you want to distort something, you can hold the Command key. And when you hold Command, you can change these arrows. You can actually distort the perspective. So this is a 4-pin warp. We're not going to do a 4-pin warp. All we're actually going to do is pull this out. And by holding Shift, I can lock it. And by pulling this out, you can see that those lines will adjust. You can see the line here that I'm looking at is the building. If I do this side too, you can see that the other lines will start to line up as well. Now this is basically counter distortion. Before I had distortion from the lens. Now what I'm doing is countering it just by moving these lines manually. And I can do that just by moving them over. The more you shift the camera, the more it shifts up or down, the more extreme this is going to be, and the more you're going to have to tweak these edges to get them just right. So again, I'm just going to make some little tweaks here until I get it just right. If I have one side selected and I hold Shift and Option, you can see that it'll mirror the other side. So I can go ahead and change both sides very easily. So with that in mind, all looks a little bit better. Now in this case, it's going to be close, or at least much closer to how it should be. Now my edges are a little bit funny. And by tweaking this, by pulling these bottom corners out, I've also compressed the scene. So I'm just going to go ahead and scale it up a little bit to compensate. Well, really, this doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be better than it was. And since I didn't go too crazy, and I didn't put the camera too offset, these lines can be pretty much linear. So let's just go ahead and back it out one more time until it's perfect, or close to perfect, as close to perfect as possible. Well, that looks pretty good. Scale up a little bit here to compensate. And I'll hit return. Now I have a bunch of guides in my window. To hide guides, the hotkey is Command, : and you can toggle them on and off. To hide the rulers, Command R, and we can get rid of the rulers. If I Command Z this, we're going to see the before and the after version. So basically what I've done is correct that negative perspective that I have, and I brought it back to looking a little bit more normal. If it's off, you can always change it a little bit more just to compensate, just to get it to be exactly how you want it. And anytime that you're doing that, feel free to bring up the guides. Again, the closer you can get it to perfect in the beginning, the less you have to change it later. Now that the distortion is corrected, let's move on to making some adjustments. So I'm just going to take all of these here, pull them down to the Make New folder, make a new folder, and I'm going to call this Blend. We didn't do any blending, but it still has a few layers intact. Now what I'm going to do is duplicate this by dragging it to the Make New Layer button. Command E will actually merge the whole thing into a clean layer. With a clean layer, now I can go and add some filters. And what I'm going to do is add my favorite set of filters. It comes with Nick Collection by Google, and I'm going to use Color Effects Pro. Color Effects Pro is something I focused on in tutorial number 1, and it's also not a free plugin, but we're going to be using so many different versions inside that Nick Collection that it's definitely worth checking out. You can also go to the Nick Collection website and you can download a free trial. I guarantee you'll like it. If you don't like it, you don't have to purchase it. You can definitely do this with different plugins like On One, or even just some Photoshop basics, different things like that that you want to use. It really depends on how you want to do this. But in the end, this is part of my workflow, so I want to show you guys how I get the most mileage out of every single one of my images. Inside of Color Effects Pro, just to review a little bit, if this is the first time you've ever opened Color Effects Pro, you're going to be overwhelmed. There are a ton of different things. There are a ton of different things that you may never, ever use, like Glamour Glow, graduated filters, graduated fog, if you want to. They're really useful things, but they're not crucial. I actually have starred all the ones that I use in this type of photography and the ones we're going to be covering in this tutorial. And if you star your own here, just by clicking on the left, you can click on Favorites, and you'll apply all your favorites just to this one menu, and you don't have to look at that overwhelming list. So under Favorites, I'm going to start with Pro Contrast. Pro Contrast is a very powerful plugin because with one slider, it's able to do some things that you're not able to replicate easily inside of Photoshop with one simple slider. And that is protect the highlights and shadows while making dramatic differences to the midtones and the quarter tones. Quarter tones are right next to the midtone. Basically, you have shadows, quarter tones, midtones, quarter tones, highlights. And what the dynamic contrast does is it basically puts more contrast in those quarter tones. So just by dragging this to the right, you can see that it really adds more enhancement to the overall scene. Correct contrast, what it'll do is it'll examine the histogram, and as I roll over to the right, you can see that it'll try to compensate by sliding it and exposing everything correctly. We've done a very big thing of trying to protect our highlights here, so we want to be very careful not to clip our highlights. So if you want to use a little bit of the correct contrast, but you don't want to go too far and you want to protect the highlights, you can protect them by clipping them here. So let's say I bring this up too far, and then I roll over the protect highlights to 100%, you can see that that's going to try to protect those highlights. So if you want to protect the highlights and correct the contrast, you can do both just by sliding this over. It's very, very simple. So I'm going to find a nice balance between here and here. Correct color cast is something that we're going to use every once in a while, and you have to really see. Usually if something's too cold, it'll make it warm. If something's too warm, it'll make it cool. It's basically going to find the complementary color. And if I slide this to the right, you can see that it's basically adding green. And right now, I don't like that effect. I actually like the overwhelming blue of the scene. I don't want it to fight too much against those rocks. So I'm going to find a nice little balance here. You can see before and after, we can start to get much more punch, much more vibrance and kick to the scene right away. The next thing I want to add is something that works pretty well for color. Now, a big question I get all the time is whether or not I use a polarizer in my photography, and the answer is very, very rarely do I use a polarizer. Later on in this tutorial, we're going to see how you can use a polarizer to mitigate reflections on glass when you're shooting through windows. But when I'm shooting night photography or blue hour photography, I never use a polarizer. I rarely use filters because I can drag the shutter as long as I want naturally through the camera. Polarizers can cause issues with some of the colors, issues with some of the reflections, and sometimes they add 1 to 2 stops of neutral density, which I don't want because it's already so dark. I want to be able to shoot at f8 and get a 30 or 60 second exposure of whatever I want. So if you want that same color effect, a lot of people like polarizers because they really punch blues. So with the polarizer, I can actually change this, change the strength, and you can see I can punch up those blues. So that's just an option. I'm going to show you guys a way to do that a little bit later without using this, but if you wanted deeper, richer blues, that's a good way to do that. So right now, all I really want to focus on is some extra pro contrast here, and that's all I'm going to do, and I'm going to apply it by saying OK. Overall, that result looks pretty good. I still think it's a little bit intense. You can see before and after. I feel it's starting to really, I don't know, I just don't like the lighting too much. So what I'm going to do is roll back that opacity, and I'm going to figure out how much of that effect I like. And in this case, I think I like about 50 to 60% of that effect. So what I'm going to do is basically take this new color effects layer and merge it down by clicking Command E. And that's just going to merge it down. So now I have 60% of that result baked into that original file. Next thing I want to do is something that's a little bit more selective. I want to go back into Color Effects Pro, but I really want to put the emphasis of contrast since I have so much tonality here, so much artificial and natural light working together, that I want to accentuate the lighting on these rocks, especially down here. You can see I have this warm light hitting these peaks of the rock. So I want the viewer to essentially see the light here, and I want their eye to wrap all the way around into this beautiful scene. We'll go back up to Filter, Nik Collection, Color Effects Pro. Here's where it gets pretty fun. We used Pro Contrast before as a global toggle. So let's say we have some of the dynamic contrast set, and I really like what it's doing to the rocks here. In fact, I'd like to go a little bit more intense on those rocks. But I don't want it to affect any of the water. I don't have to use any masking. Nothing complicated in Photoshop. I can actually solve that by using the control points, or what Nik Collection calls U points. And let's just say I want it to only exist in the rocks. I can click on Add a Control Point, and if I click there on the rocks, you can see that now it's only going to affect that area. Let's take a closer look of what it's actually doing. If I roll it down, click on the mask button, you'll see that these are intelligent points. They try to figure out exactly what I'm trying to work on. And just like Photoshop, I can hold the Option key and duplicate just by clicking and dragging. So let's say I want these just in these rocks, but let's say that I don't want them somewhere else. I can add a negative viewpoint, and I can get rid of it in the water. So I can basically just chisel out these rocks and make sure that I don't have anything else in the scene that's affected by this. And once I'm happy with the selection that I've made, I can just click on this again, and I can see that my result is now just going to be in the rocks in the foreground. So that's a really cool thing to be able to do, just adding selective extra contrast in these areas without doing any complicated masking. Something else that I might want to do, just one more thing really quick, is add one more filter, and that's tonal contrast. By default, if you've used this before, you know that tonal contrast takes it way out of control. So you have to go and reset all of these back to normality. So what we want to do here is we just want to use subtlety. Subtlety in the midtones, subtlety in the shadows. All I'm looking for is an extra little bit of kick. If I turn this on and off, pay special attention to down here, you can see that it's adding more contrast. That's actually too much. I'm going to go 7 and 7. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to lock these control points in so that I can basically just isolate these. I don't want it to be everywhere. I only want it to be in a few select places, really just on this area right here, and maybe a little bit here. So I can change the size of these points. I can change their impact or their opacity. And I can really quickly create sort of a custom fall off of sharpening here. Just get rid of it everywhere else, and I'll basically apply it. Nice. So you can see the before and after here. I have heavy contrast in these rocks. It really pops those rocks out. Really nice. It's exactly what I want. Now, here's something that I don't like. I like it here. Don't like it over here. It looks like I went a little crazy with the U points. So what I'm actually going to do is brush this in selectively. And I'm going to do that by adding a mask. But I'm going to add a black mask because I want all this to be invisible. If I hold the Option key and click the mask button, it will create a black mask. Essentially, that just means that nothing will be visible. If this was a white mask, if I would have just created a new mask by clicking once, everything would be invisible. Black, invisible, white, visible. So that means that basically, if it's set to black, I can select the paintbrush tool, adjust the size, and I can actually paint everything in myself. Now, just to give you a little refresher on how I work, I'm working with the Wacom Intuos Pro series and a stylus, which allows me to have a few customizable buttons. So while I have all this pressure sensitivity, I also have a custom button bound to my express keys. And I can show you guys that here. I should go ahead and show you the Wacom tablet options here, that my pen pressure I can set. I have it set just to medium. You can see the harder I press, the more opacity or more flow will come out of the brush. But I also have these two keys set to right click, and I have a modifier. On Mac, it's Control plus Option, and I can actually change the brush size. So let me show you how this works inside of Photoshop. If I press that button on my stylus and roll right to left, it changes the size. Up and down changes the hardness. This is really powerful because if I set the flow to something like 10%, I can paint softly, and then the opacity will accumulate. And the opacity will accumulate as long as I have this option checked here. So what I can do here on my mask, and I'll just do this in the black mask mode so we can see what's happening, I can just lightly paint on areas, changing the size and changing the hardness or softness of the brush. So with that applied and that in mind, I can go ahead and brush this effect in exactly where I want it. Only want it on these rocks here. Just on the rocks. That's where I spent most of the time. And if I hit the / key on the keyboard, it'll show the quick mask. It'll show where all of this is happening. Just there. That's exactly where I want it. I actually don't want it right here. So just selectively, just like that, I'll turn the quick mask off. And rather than merging down before, I'm actually going to duplicate this, Command J to duplicate layer, and I'm going to merge these down because I'm building this progressively so we can take a look at the steps. So what this was is Color Effects Pro, and we'll call this Contrast. Call this layer Color Effects Pro, and we'll call this Tonal Contrast. And also say Rocks, just so we know, so we can stay organized from the beginning. So I can basically at any point toggle these on and off, take down the opacity, or change things on the fly as I feel I need to. We're going to do a few color corrections to this, but before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and get into the sharpening. For the sharpening, for the D810 being 36 megapixel, I'm going to use a high-pass filter. To use a high-pass filter, the first thing I need to do is duplicate the layer that I want to use as a high-pass. Command J again on the keyboard. Go up to Filter, Other, High-Pass. I'm going to turn high pass way up. I explained this before in the first tutorial, but if you're new to the high pass filter, it's very easy to use. You have a radius. The radius, what happens, it's going to find the edges of an image. And finding the edges of the image, it's going to create micro contrast around those edges. So if I look at these rocks, it's actually going to create sort of a halo on the outside and a shadow on the inside so that it pops these out, makes them look three-dimensional. 7 is way too much. You can see as I turn this up, it gets ridiculous. 4 36 megapixel files, 3 to 5 pixels works really well. And basically, once I say OK, it's going to apply it. And I'm going to use a blending mode called overlay. When overlay is enabled, anything that is 50% gray will disappear, and anything that is less than 50% gray or above 50% gray will overlay. So darker will burn, lighter will dodge. Since this is around the edges, we're actually dodging and burning the edges. So if I do that here with overlay set, and I look at all the little detail in the houses here, and I turn this on and off, you can see that it basically pops those edges out, makes all those windows look super intense, super poppy, and just awesome. So what I'm going to do is do this selectively. I'm going to hold Option again, create a new mask, select the brush tool. This time, I'm going to set the flow to 0, so 100% opacity, and I'm basically just going to start painting this on exactly where I want it. If I hit the backslash key, I can show a quick mask, and basically I can just paint this in exactly where I want it. I basically want it in the foreground, in some of the buildings, but not in the background. Basically, the rule with sharpening is you don't want to sharpen anything that should be naturally soft to begin with. In this case, obviously the water. So I'm being very careful about the edges. I don't want to sharpen any water because that's going to create noise. I also don't want to sharpen any of the sky. So by masking it in just to the foreground here, it basically puts the focus just on the foreground and all the sharpening just on the foreground. So it'll accentuate those areas. So that's very powerful. So basically you can even see in the rocks here, we've done a lot to these rocks. And now with the high pass filter, it chisels those edges and it makes it look really sharp and very powerful and pronounced. We have so many files to get through, so many exciting things to work on in this tutorial. There are only a few more things I want to do this. I'm going to start introducing new things as we go. But the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the color. We have this beautiful blue color. Anytime we have a blue sky, blue water, all this blue, that's the ambient light that's hitting the scene, we're going to have some issues. We're going to have what's called a blue color cast. And you can see that usually in pooling highlights and shadows. You can see some of the blue here. You can also see the blue in this water wash. So in my opinion, there should not be this much blue in this water wash. So what can we do to get rid of it? Well, what we can do is create a hue saturation layer. Do that by saying hue saturation here in the adjustment layers, create new adjustment layer. And I'm going to pull down the saturation, but I'm going to do it specifically in the blue channel. Let me back this up to full screen so we can take a look at what happens. If I pull the saturation down, obviously that's going to get rid of the blue and everything. But that's not what I want to do. I have a little bit of overlap. There's some yellow overlapping the blue here. There's yellow overlapping the blue here as well. What I want to do is just lock this down specifically to the blues. I can expand the selection into cyan as well just by dragging this. Basically, whatever area is selected here is the target area that will be influenced. So if I take the saturation now, watch this area and also watch the sky. You can see that it's going to remove all of that saturation. Well, that's sort of on the right track. What we can do instead is we can also change the lightness. How much white or black is in the blues? So if I move this up, you can see that it'll change the lightness. As a side effect, it'll make this a little bit lighter, which is nice. Then I can compensate by pulling the saturation down a little bit, just a little bit until it mitigates that blue color, that blue cast, without taking it out completely. I don't want it to be 100%, just enough to where it's gone. So that looks good. I'm going to go ahead and black out this mask. I can do that by selecting the mask and pressing Command-I for invert on the keyboard there. I'm going to select a brush, smaller brush. I'm going to zoom in. And I'm basically going to paint out the blue that's in the water first. I'm going to paint out some of the blue that's here just to clean that up. Be careful though, because I can also paint out the blue of the boat. We definitely want the boat to be there. We just want to get rid of any blue that's hiding in these rocks. Specifically did this because there are some heavy blues in some of the rocks here, and also not only in these pooling shadows, sometimes in these highlights, but also in this water. Don't want that blue in the water. Don't want it there at all. I want it to be really clean. I want that water wash to be pure and white. And then anywhere here too where you see blue, The color balance here from Capture One did a great job keeping all this warm, but there's still going to be a few issues in a few different places. So even around this area here, if we want that to be a little bit crisper, a little bit more white, we can get rid of it somewhere around here as well. And that looks pretty good. I know it seems minor, but these are the small things that you have to do to make things look even better. So we've removed some of the blues. Now, what if we want to separate the rocks? Take a look closer here. Oh, this is a really cool sort of castle home. You can also see it's sort of the leaning home. Everything else is straight. These are very old buildings, so some of them do lean, and I was very careful to pick the ones that I know are actually vertical before I trusted them to be vertical. You can see a little bit in the hue saturation. Let me just clean up some of the blue here really quick. But what I want to focus on here is the rocks. Now, I want to make these rocks a little bit darker, but just like I mitigated the blue, I also want to mitigate some of this yellow. The reason being is not that I don't like the yellow color. It's just that I feel that most of the color is represented in the town and kind of distracts the rocks. So I'm going to do that by using the same technique, hue saturation. Move this over so we can see. Now if I just go to reds, I expand red into yellow and orange, and now I change the lightness. You can see that it's going to change the darkness of these rocks a little bit. So what I can do is darken the rocks, the areas that are red around the rock, and pull the saturation out a little bit. So something's not a little subtle like that, negative 24, 25, and negative 10. And I'll go ahead and black out this mask as well. I'm going to paint this in selectively now, so I'm going to darken the areas around the red color. And this is going to look pretty much like this. And you can see that I'm removing the saturation in these rocks. Just removing that saturation. Darkening this whole area here, darkening it all here. And you can see there's a lot of yellow out here. You might want to be careful around this area, maybe remove some of it just so it's not as predominant. It's going to darken it. And what that's going to do is just shift some of the focus from this area back into the buildings. I just want that removed. The nice thing is I'm using the stylus. It's perfect. I can just go ahead and brush this stuff in, brush this stuff out. If I make a mistake here, no problem. I can either Command Z to undo, or I can just swap my palette from black to white by hitting the X key. And that's going to swap black to white, painting on or off. So now I can just go ahead and remove it here. Watch the difference that this makes here. I'm going to use a harder edge brush, and I'm just going to paint around this walkway. Watch that disappear. That's great. And what this is doing is it's chiseling out the details that are more important, but it's also creating a little bit of separation for me in the elements. So now this whole area here feels like a different area than the background. And that's all that's really meant to do. Same thing here. I can remove a little bit of the warmth in the rocks if I want to, if I want them to be a little darker. In this case, I want the warmth to stay, so I'll leave it. But basically, I'm just going to paint around this and just do it by hand, by hand. And you can see that quite a powerful effect, actually, to be able to mitigate those colors here and control the eye movement with color. And you can see if I option click the mask, it's not that beautiful. But that's okay, it's just color. I actually call these garbage masks, and based on the way they look, you can kind of see why. Well, that looks pretty good. Last thing I'm going to do is kind of bring up the vibrance of this. Not vibrance in color, but vibrance in contrast. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring up a curves layer here. Say curves. And I want to make the whole scene a little bit brighter. You can see I have this massive gap of highlights. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull this up a little bit all around. Just like that. And you can see that that's going to slide the histogram over. But see what's happening? I'm actually blowing out some of the highlights. That's no problem at all. I'm just going to grab that paintbrush tool again. And I'm going to paint out the areas that we're having problems with a highlight. So I'm just going to go ahead and paint out that effect in the town. I think the town is very well balanced. And you can see as I do that, when I start to bring this up, you can see that it's going to remove those areas. So based on whatever mask is applied to my adjustment layer is going to show actively the histogram inside of that mask. So you can see if I want to bring this up even more, I can bring up the contrast even more and then go in, compensate by painting out some of it. And you can see that that'll reflect. So this whole area can get sort of less vibrancy and contrast. I can even paint some of it back here. Very easy, very quick. It allows me to go from here to here. So just a little bit brighter overall. And these can all be fine-tuned. All these adjustments can be fine-tuned. I can protect the shadows a little bit just by pulling this down, just a little bit. Last thing, just add a little bit of global contrast. So brightness and contrast. Maybe like 10%, just to pop all the values a little bit more. Later on, we'll go through some different ways to do the same things a little bit more efficiently. But for right now, I just wanted to get you guys familiar again with basic masking and a single exposure adjustment and blue hour. Before we finish, we can go ahead and take a look at everything that we've done. This is where it's nice. Sometimes if you work on files for a long time, it's good to look at the original. So here's where we started from here, and then we've brought back all of these values, all of these different tones, and made it really sharp and visually interesting. So it's really nice. At any point, we can backtrack and see what we did, what we applied, and we can make changes anywhere along the way. For example, maybe these rocks, I thought I darkened a little bit too much. I can either go into the effect, or I can change the opacity and say, I liked about half of what I did there. So we can make changes here. Same thing with the blues. See if we like that. With the curves, I definitely like the curves. And the brightness and contrast overall. So you can say, well, maybe that was too much. Instead of 14, maybe half it, or close to half, around 8. And with that, it's just a fine-tuning based on your own monitor calibration, your own preferences for color. That wraps it up for this lesson. Bear in mind that I did spend a little extra time explaining some of the beginner stuff in this lesson because I want to be able to move forward in the future lessons and not have to overly explain things. I want to be able to move quicker. So if you're not familiar with everything that I covered in this lesson, it might be a good idea to watch it one more time before you move on.